On Britain's Sunday Brunch, via a report from EW, Aykroyd said, "It made a lot of money around the world, but it just cost too much, making it economically not feasible to do another one. So that's too bad. The director, he spent too much money on it. He didn't shoot scenes we suggested to him, several scenes that were going to be needed, and he said, no, we don't need them. And then we tested the movie, and they needed them." And he had to go back, about 30 to 40 million in reshoots. So yeah, he will not be back on the Sony lot anytime soon.
Okay, so building off of Dan Aykroyd's remarks, the main problem with Ghostbusters is, of course, it just didn't make enough money at the box office. But here we're going to look at the more broader picture in terms of corporate politics and marketing as to why the film just didn't succeed in getting a major audience. Now, some of the cast have sort of made the more sexist explanation that it just didn't work because the male audience didn't really connect to it. There's the obvious counter that Wonder Woman a year later made a huge amount of money, so that seems like weak. But let's go into it. So Melissa McCarthy is like, yeah, she thinks it was basically just sexist trolling by people and Trump supporters and things like that. But again, if you look at the larger context that films released before and afterwards, whether it's By the Sea, Pan, Tarzan, Lone Ranger, you go through the list, a lot of male-driven, male stars, male directors, that just flopped, even with a female director with By the Sea with Angelina Jolie, which had her and Brad Pitt. That also flopped. So even if you have the exact case study where you had this update of an old intellectual property and things like that, it just didn't work. And it didn't matter whether it had a male star or female star. It just wasn't able to grab an audience. So the sexist explanation doesn't work too well. Also, if you look at the RT ratings, the critics were actually fairly good to Ghostbusters. Only a few of them were very critical of it. It holds an over 70% rating, which makes it rated fresh. And a lot of these critics are men. And yet the Game of Thrones rating is much, much lower. But Leslie Jones is saying that, by even remaking it with the 2020 version, they're sort of slapping the cast in the face. But again, I think you want to take a more moderate opinion on this, is that, Sony was always very clear that they just wanted a big hit franchise, because at the time, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, Spider-Man wasn't working out. The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2 made a lot of money, but it didn't make as much money as they expected, so they were very hungry for franchises, and they saw that the Ghostbusters video game was doing extremely well, so they were like, okay, there's still a hunger for Ghostbusters, let's just get this cast together, let's get a script together. And Aykroyd in other interviews was very, despondent that they weren't going to use more of his script and some of his ideas, and he didn't like that the original Ghostbusters weren't going to be included as much except for cameo roles. But again, over the long term, they had been trying to do Ghostbusters scripts for decades, and Bill Murray was very reluctant to do it. He and Harold Ramis had a lot of personal issues, so the original cast coming back and doing the roles was becoming just almost impossible. So it was clear they were going to have to move on to a new generation. I think the problem is that by doing an all-female cast and just slapping Ghostbusters on it, they weren't really paying attention to what made the originals work. It wasn't enough to just make it a lot of action scenes and comedy. I mean, the reason that Ghostbusters worked, it was a very adult kind of comedy combined with these supernatural elements and just having these four guys who are just after a paycheck, and that's why they're doing it. As Zedmore said, I'll believe anything if you give me a paycheck. That was the kind of sensibility that made the originals really, really work, but these really didn't take that seriously. They just made this all-female cast into superheroes and generically slapped the Ghostbusters logo on it. And again, maybe that would have worked. I mean, Paul and the cast seemed to enjoy themselves, and that SNL humor sometimes kind of works, but it didn't work in this case. So Sony didn't make a lot of money, so again, they're just going to move on. Now, whether it was really Paul Feig ultimately, Sony has gone back and said, well, Aykroyd was a little inaccurate. It wasn't at 40 million. It was more like, 4 or 5 million. But whatever the exact number, they were clearly spending way, way too much. And they were trying to build up this major franchise with a sequel and an animated series already on the way. And they were just, they were just wanting a franchise that just wasn't there. So now let's go to the 2020 version. And again, we don't have a lot of plot details, so we have to be very speculative about what it's about. And it seems like they're going back to one of the original ideas, which was, let's just pass it on to a new generation. Let's have the daughter or son of the Ghostbusters move on with the Ghostbusters legacy. And I have to say, I'm trying to be as consistent and as honest as possible. I just don't have a lot of high hopes for the series at this point. It seems, again, we're just not paying attention to what Ghostbusters and what made it work. And it was, again, these very middle-aged guys just trying to do this for a mixture of motives. Some people wanted to do it for science. Some people wanted to do it for money. So just making the cast a lot younger and changing the gender and race isn't really kind of learning the lesson, which is it has to meet this kind of weird sensibility of what made the Ghostbusters work. And I know we can say that, well, we had the cartoon and that was already very juvenile. But again, we still had these adults, yes, in uniform, yes, they acted more like superheroes, but that was aimed at a much younger audience. The film, the reason it worked and became such a hit is it managed to get all these different age groups. It really managed to get both the family-friendly audience and this much more adult audience together. And the reboot in 2016 really didn't have that. It didn't really have a strong identity to go beyond its base. And this 2020 version just seems to be going back to that. It's like, okay, we're moving away from the originals, but we're going to hopefully have enough original moments or elements that people will like how we're sort of refashioning it. But again, it's the same thing. It's just a very corporate marketed product. Now, hopefully the script is stronger, the direction is stronger. It looks like definitely the special effects are much, much better. Though I did think the middle sections in the 2016 were okay. So at least on paper, it looks a lot better, but it's more because we're judging it against the 2016 version. And there's also not the Trump politics. I mean, it's really curious that he's not saying anything about there being a female Ghostbuster in this one. So, yeah, you have to see that the 2016 was just a lot of, bad things and bad politics were getting into it with online trolling and Trump. But, again, at the end of the day, it just wasn't a strong enough film. So no matter how strong the marketing, you're just inevitably going to have to face up, why would any American or Chinese person want to see this? There's just not this hunger for Ghostbusters, and you've moved so far from what made the originals work that it's going to be a very, very hard time to replicate the results of what you want to happen with this franchise. But I want to end off by saying I don't think that Amy Pascal or Sony are just a bunch of evil corporate devils. I mean, they do have some good ideas. They were originally going to do Sonic. But CEO Tom Rothman just passed on it and said, yeah, we paid this much for development costs, but let's let somebody else do it. So they do have a good nose for what will make a lot of money and what will work and what will connect. But I just think they just had some bad ideas and bad marketing plans for Ghostbusters 2016. It was supposed to be just this weird, fun, big-budget blockbuster that everyone would enjoy, but it turned into a very kind of stale comedy with just bad CGI and not very original ideas either visually or dramatically. So again, it just wasn't going to be a strong enough film to really reach this massive audience that they wanted. But overall, I don't think Sony had the wrong instinct in trying to bring back Ghostbusters. I certainly do want to see more Ghostbusters. And I just don't think, though, that this 2020 version is going to do the numbers they want again. So I think we're just going to, 5 and 10 years, going to see another version of Ghostbusters, but hopefully they've learned more of the lessons about why this one didn't work in 2016 and why the 2021 probably isn't also going to connect with audiences. Because I do think there is a role for Ghostbusters, but not necessarily the one that they want. Okay, this has been an SW Analytic commentary on Ghostbusters 2016 and 2020. Hope you like it. If you enjoy, please subscribe or hit the like button.